But I would be remiss just to focus on democracy and the concept of partaking in electoral processes, because Venezuelan democracy goes much further than traditional notions of bourgeois democracy, which says that democracy is just going to the polls every 4 years, or at least, and in the US context, choosing between two corporate capitalist parties, mainly the Democrats and the Republicans. But in Venezuela, not only is democracy not limited to electoral processes, and it actually goes much further. It's about devolving some of the power that the state has to local communities. So, for example, setting up the communes.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to our show, consider smashing that subscribe button. If you're already our subscriber, consider being a member. It's very, very inexpensive. In either case, hit a like and enjoy the show. Without further ado, let me welcome Joe Alexandra. Joe is a journalist and co-editor of People's Dispatch. She covers social movements and left politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. Joe, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to discuss Venezuela with you, and in the context of the very contested, recently concluded election. But before we discuss some of those specifics, if I could ask you to talk a little bit about Venezuelan democracy in general, because one of the fascinating things I find is that there is so much propaganda about Venezuela not being a democracy. And on the other hand, as Jimmy Carter said, it has one of the most robust electoral systems. I remember reading between 1998 and 2015, there were about 15 elections in which 3 times the ruling party conceded defeat. Social media or media is very, very free. There are huge protests all the time. So if you could tell us a little bit as a background about the openness and existence of democracy in general in Venezuela.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because that's one of these key lines of messaging and narratives that the mainstream media in the United States and in a lot of other global North countries attempts to propagate, that this idea that there's no democracy. And it's completely untrue. I mean, even just looking at the past presidential elections, there were actually 10 candidates, 9 of them, which of course were running to win against Nicolas Maduro. So, interesting, coming from the United States, we have a bipartisan system that suppresses any possible third-party alternative. On the other hand, you have Venezuela, which has, dozens of political parties, 10 of which decided to participate in the last presidential elections. But, there's even more parties that are out there. Some of them joined into electoral coalitions. So on one hand, you have this robust and, very high participation in political life in Venezuela, both of left and progressive sectors, but even of the opposition and of people who aren't necessarily so happy with the Bolivarian revolution. It's quite interesting because the US, when they create this whole narrative that there's a dictatorship, that there's an autocratic leader, they leave out, for example, that actually a lot of the main media in the country is actually still controlled by the right wing and opposition forces. In a sense, it also speaks to a weakness or a unfinished task of the Bolivarian Revolution, in the sense that there are still a lot of private media companies out there. If you're talking about a full-on dictatorship, you would have the existence of dissident media that is actually, funded by a lot of the big capitalists that want to get back in power would, of course, not be existent. There's a lot to say regarding how media works, but I think that's just another example of, this whole idea of everything being controlled by the government. no opportunity to freedom of expression. That's of course completely untrue. And actually, one of the main lines of attack has been through this corporate media, has been through right-wing media. For example, the coup d'etat against Hugo Chavez in 2002 was essentially waged on the TV and had a huge participation of these major media groups. Um, as you mentioned, there have been, I think it's actually over 30 electoral processes since 1998, including different sort of referendums, consultations. So there's, again, a very active and vibrant participation in how people uh, shape the future of their country, going to the polls, participating in these electoral processes. But I would be remiss just to focus on democracy and the concept of partaking in electoral processes, because Venezuelan democracy goes much further than traditional notions of bourgeois democracy, which says that democracy is just going to the polls every 4 years, or at least, and in the US context, choosing between two corporate capitalist parties, mainly the Democrats and the Republicans. But in Venezuela, not only is democracy not limited to electoral processes, and it actually goes much further. It's about devolving some of the power that the state has to local communities. So, for example, setting up the communes in the country, which are, councils that are created in communities where people decide how their community should be running, what sort of resources they need. Is it a health clinic? Is it a public works project? These different councils are grouped together to create communal councils in different regions of the country. Of course, there are agricultural communes, there are different productive communes, but this is an exercise that actually has been stimulated and encouraged by the government in Venezuela, so that the people are actually building their own power and building structures so that in the future, the central state actually, would have less power and the people would have more power to really decide about their futures and the way they want the country to go. Of course, this is a very long process, and a country that is currently under siege is right now, of course, focused on defending itself against US attacks and sanctions. But again, this process has never been detained. It has never been stopped, and the people continue to build these structures of people's democracy, of people's power on local levels, on regional levels, and actually engaging more people in the process, especially when looking at the comparison with the United States. There's such a disconnect to who's holding office and the masses of people. In Venezuela, there's actually, working people are not only participating in the high branches of governance, but they're also building, again, these local structures of engaging the community and having people really involved in processes of decision making, and how they manage economic resources and all the rest. So it's interesting when you have, these imperialist countries talking about democracy. And I focus on the US because the US is the main source of the attacks against Venezuela, when really this democracy is one of the most robust, and people in the US could learn a lot about democratic participation through the example of Venezuela.
I think this is an excellent context to even some of the things I would return back to, but I do want to, for a moment, discuss the maybe less substantive issue, but important issue, which is the recently concluded election. Given you have been reporting from Caracas, I'm not sure if you have also visited other cities there. I think there are essentially two diametrically opposing views that we are hearing. One is the sort of Western corporate media, the Financial Times, the New York Times, Washington Post, backed by the research of Alta Vista, Edison Research, and so on. And also their ideologues like Francis Fukuyama and all his bunch writing these horrible articles in the Financial Times, which says that this is all rigged. Maybe like Maduro hasn't had more than 33% of the votes. And then on the other side is I would say a section of the left, and we would come back to this question of why I'm saying a section of the left who says that this was a completely fair and free election. You have reported from ground. Can you share with us some of the things that you witnessed there?
Yeah, and a very important question. So I was on the ground, just ahead of the elections, was visiting different voting precincts on July 28th. I've, witnessed and covered elections across Latin America, and definitely this was one of the cases where you could see, a lot of peacefulness, a lot of calm, people just going out to the polls, casting their vote, getting on with their day, or maybe hanging out with their community. I visited one of the communes in Caracas. People had gone out to vote, and then we're, just in their community chatting, talking about the country, talking about the politics. So, of course, just having gone to a couple of voting stations in Caracas doesn't give me the authority to say that how the entire day went, but of course, reading reports, seeing different reports on what was happening across the country, it was a day that kind of proceeded with calm, with normalcy, and with general respect towards this democratic process. I think what's interesting is that the mainstream media, as you said, Financial Times, New York Times, had already cast a shadow on the electoral process before it even happened. Um, Leading up to these elections, if you look at any one of those news outlets, they would have an article that already talked about fraud, that already talked about an illegitimate voting process, that already talked about a series of doubts that they were raising with regards to Venezuela's elections. So it really came as no surprise that on Sunday, as the polls were closing, the only narrative that they wanted to push was that something had gone wrong. And why is it that that is the narrative that they want to push? Well, of course, because what was clear is that Nicolas Maduro was likely going to win these elections, albeit not in a landslide. He won with 51% with compared to Edmundo Gonzalez with 44%. This is not a landslide, but also this sort of result is expected, as I said, when elections are being held in a moment of economic siege and of constant attacks from the right wing and from the United States. And what's interesting is that once the opposition alleges fraud and says that actually Edmundo Gonzalez is the one who won the elections, and not that he won with a very neck and neck race, 55%, maybe 45% with Maduro. No, they actually go so far as to make the claim that Edmundo Gonzalez won with 70% of the vote and that Nicolas Maduro won 30%. First of all, there's 8 other candidates, so those numbers don't really add up. And second of all, this completely contradicts all other, not necessarily electoral polls, but understanding of the political and social makeup of the country. Chavismo has historically had a strong base of about 50% of the population. And so the fact that in their alleged exit polling, in their sort of what they're calling the vote tallies collection that they conducted, apparently, they're somehow negating that like 50% of the population in Venezuela actually still really supports Chavismo, and that somehow that has completely dropped and shifted to the far right, which is very unpopular in the country. This is the same sector that supported Juan Guaido, that is calling for sanctions, that has called for coup attempts. It is just very hard to believe that somehow such a massive political shift happened. And they seem so completely a little bit blatant and a bit far-fetched to actually concoct these numbers, and especially given that they're so far off from the official results, they're so far off from all of the previous polling that was not conducted by their own pollsters. So it's pretty ridiculous. And then you have these outlets running with this number without questioning it, without even asking where it comes from. And where it comes from is their own internal audit of the elections. And so, how are these mainstream media outlets who are allegedly committed to truth telling going to believe one party's tallies, which one party who has been constantly attacking the democratic system of a country, which already said that these elections were going to be fraudulent, which already barely wanted to participate, which didn't sign an agreement saying that they would respect the results. And now they have their own separate tally that is not verified, that is private, that has no sort of third party review, and that this becomes the truth. It's so blatant and it's so uh, unfortunate that these outlets seem to have less respect to the truth when it comes to Venezuela, but it's also not unexpected. This is exactly what happened in 2019 when they all rushed behind the self-proclamation of Juan Guaido as interim president of Venezuela with absolutely no legal basis. They have their own political narrative, they have their own political interests, and they essentially will rearrange whatever evidence they need to continue flaunting this narrative. And I think it's important to remember that this is exactly what they had said months before the elections took place. So all they were doing is continuing to tell the same story and cherry picking what they needed to continue supporting this narrative.
I want to come back to my earlier comment about sections of the left, and you have been covering the left for a very long time. I think one of the things that I wanted to ask you is that while, let's say, in 2019, most of the left of center kind of journal, I'm thinking about Democracy Now! Or Jacobin, they were very clear that this is just a coup. There is no electoral process involved. He's not even run for, Guaido not hasn't even run for president, and so on. This time, a lot of these, at least left of center, and let's not get into the debate about who is more left and so on, they have not taken a position. For instance, Democracy Now! Invited Edgardo Lander and Nina Farnina, and they offered two very different positions. Nina, as an observer from the US, said this was by and large a fair and free election. We have nothing to doubt about it. While Venezuelan is considered leftist, Edgardo Lander, sociologist, said that he has no doubt that Maduro has failed to show evidence of him winning this election. And I'll also discuss a Jacobin article later in a different context. What I'm saying is that even within the left, there seems to be a division this time. Why do you think that's the case this time?
Well, I would say that it's not just this time. There's always the left historically has divisions, especially over Venezuela. It has, not, it has been one of the most demonized countries by US imperialism. And of course, US imperialism has been reinventing its tactics, its ways of demonizing countries. It knows that it's necessary to break the mass support that the project had. And this is done in a variety of ways. We know that a lot of there's often this comment made that, well, Maduro's no Chavez. I supported Chavez, but I don't support Maduro. And this, I don't think, is an accident. The US, after Chavez tragically died in 2013 and Nicolas Maduro was elected president, the US began one of the most severe campaigns of economic warfare that, that's trumped not maybe by the campaign against Cuba, the sanctions, of course, the deadly sanctions that Iraq faced, but really one of the most brutal and suffocating sanctions regimes. And so when people talk about, well, Maduro's no Chavez, it's true. Yeah, he is not Chavez. That's a fact. He's a different person. And if you look at the conditions that he's been faced with, they have been of economic warfare. Of course, there were attacks against the Bolivarian project under Chavez, but this past 10 years of Nicolas Maduro being at the helm of the Bolivarian project has seen almost non-stop attacks, whether it's the sanctions on the oil sector or cutting Venezuela off from the international financial system, seizing its assets overseas. This has been one of the most incessant campaigns of economic strangulation that we've seen. And so, of course, the ability of the Bolivarian project to provide in the same way that had been providing for its people was limited. There was an over 90% drop in its GDP. This means that the same social projects that had been able to fund was very compromised. This, of course, coincided with a large wave of migration out of Venezuela because of these dire economic conditions. When there's a 90% drop in your GDP, how are people going to survive? This was, of course, exactly the intent of the economic sanctions. And yes, this means that when people look at Venezuela, what they see is not the triumphant Bolivarian revolution that's of the 2000s, where there was a lot of prosperity for the people. They see a project that's under duress, that's struggling, that's trying many different ways to actually lift the boot of these over 900 sanctions off its neck. And this is not a pretty process. This is not something that looks shiny and great and prosperous. It's a difficult process, and it's a very intense struggle. And I think it's impossible to undermine the difficulties that the Venezuelan people have been faced with over the past 10 years under ferocious attacks from US imperialism. But this means that a sector of the left that was very comfortable supporting the very successful first wave of the Bolivarian Revolution felt that it was harder to support this project when it was under these attacks from US imperialism and conditions were a lot tougher. It is hard to defend a project that is, of course, I guess for these sort of sectors that sees such a massive wave of immigration. But of course, the principled position is to demand an end to US sanctions and to support the Venezuelan people in their time of difficulties, because of course we know, looking at the examples of Cuba, looking at other examples in the global south of the over 30 countries that are under US sanctions, the goal of these sanctions is not only to crush the people within these countries, make them revolt, make them turn against the project, but also to discredit it internationally. And I think to some extent this has happened, and we've seen some sectors that have turned its back against Venezuela, unfortunately, as it continues to face attacks from imperialism. But I think many, many more sectors and people of conscience across the globe continue to defend Venezuela, continue to demand an end to US attacks against the country, and to demand that the country can actually live in peace, assert its sovereignty, and be able to provide for the people.
I think one of the fascinating things I found about the relationship between the sanctions and the economy was, as you said, since 2013, the sanctions went up and the economy started to go downhill. And in 2020, Biden started to relax some of these sanctions, essentially perhaps driven by Chevron and BP and Shell and others, because they were collaborating with the Venezuelan state oil sector. And also, I suspect there were pressures from the creditors who wanted to recover some of their debts. But ultimately, he relaxed some of these sanctions and the economy started to bounce back. That's like the graphical representation of it is very, 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 very graphic, actually. I wanted your response to one of these recent columns in Jacobin, where, as you said, this emerging literature between the difference between Chavez and Maduro found its way there. And obviously, this is there even in the New York Times these days. I mean, there are columns in the New York Times which are extremely blatant, but there are also more moderate columns which says, oh, Chavez lifted a lot of people out of poverty. He was open, he was not authoritarian, but Maduro is increasingly becoming more authoritarian. I wanted you to respond to this recent column in The Guardian by Gabriel Hetland, and he says that there are signs of authoritarianism in Maduro, and what he outlines is use of the Supreme Court to defunctionalize the National Assembly, postponing some of these local elections that you just spoke about, an arbitrary ban on opposition's leaders in participating in elections. What would be your response to that?
Well, I think first of all, this is again, if you look at the headlines of, as you said, the New York Times and all of these Western media outlets, there's a reason why they run these articles and not articles that actually talk about Venezuela's process in a nuanced way, that cover some of the successes of the Bolivarian Revolution. The word authoritarian is used in a weaponizing way by mainstream media outlets. I don't know how many articles they've run talking about Dina Boluarte, who assassinated 50 protesters after presiding over a coup against Pedro Castillo, but that's another story. There's several elements here. I mean, on one hand, again, Venezuela is constantly held up under a microscope, every single decision that it makes. When we're talking about the opposition leaders, we also need to remember who is this opposition? And I think these sort of articles completely take out of context. All they say is opposition leaders prosecuted, political persecution campaign. This is authoritarian XYZ. But what they're not saying is actually who are these opposition leaders and why are they being prosecuted? It is true that many leaders of the right wing, the far right wing opposition in Venezuela have been prosecuted. And that is because they are leading and plotting attempts to violently overthrow the government, which of course have been thwarted. But we can look at 2014 when there was a violent protest movement in the border region of Venezuela and Táchira, months and weeks of violent protests of, people attacking security forces with the goal of not, raising forward a certain social or economic or political or, something concrete about a certain struggle or cause, but really just to create instability, to create chaos, to create a climate of violence and ultimately the situation of destabilization where there would be some sort of intervention or to essentially topple the government. This, again, was in 2014, just 1 year after Hugo Chavez died and Maduro was first taking office. This was called La Salida, and it was, again, this violent attempt by far right-wing groups to topple the government. And many of the opposition leaders that are currently considered politically persecuted or sort of highlighted in these types of articles were not only involved in planning these protests, financing them, but also participating in them. In 2017, the guarimbas that took place in Caracas and other cities across Venezuela, which saw over 100 people get killed, including the lynchings of Black Venezuelans just for being Black, for being suspected of being Chavista supporters. So when we're talking about the legal repercussions of people who are leading violent, racist, and fascist violent mobs on the streets, I think many people in Venezuela were actually quite happy when these people saw justice. And in fact, they probably demand more. There was a young man, Orlando Figueroa, who was burned to death by these far-right protesters. And his family has been very active in the campaign for seeking justice against these far-right mobs. And not only the people who were carrying out this violence on the streets, but really the people who were pushing for this, who were orchestrating it, and who were financing this. These are the opposition leaders that are being persecuted, the ones who are calling for sanctions, that are going to international forums and saying, please apply economic sanctions to my country. We know that the sanctions have actually had the biggest impact on the population of Venezuela. If someone were we're going to other countries telling them to inflict suffering on their population, what kind of response should they get? They have been, in many cases, a lot of these opposition leaders haven't even seen the justice that many Venezuelan people demand that they have. Maria Corina Machado merely cannot run for public office, but she has been behind and involved in many of these different destabilization measures, in calling for sanctions, and in using her profile as an alleged sort of NGO leader to actually orchestrate a lot of the attacks against Venezuela. So when these sort of Western outlets talk about political persecution, first of all, it's of course insanely hypocritical, because these are the same countries and outlets that have supported right-wing coups that suppress political dissent in their own countries. I mean, that's really rich of the UK to kind of take that position. But also they're taking it out of context and obscuring what actually is this opposition responsible for. Because again, there's dozens of opposition parties. They have actually been engaged in dialogue with the government. There's been a series of dialogue processes over the past several years. Many people who are active in the political life. But then, of course, you have the people who are supporting violent protests and coups that have seen some sort of justice, that have been behind plots to have paramilitary invasions, to have the invasion of the Green Berets, which attempted to take place in 2020. The fact that those people are facing charges just means that the Venezuelan justice system is attempting to actually have accountability to its people, and their demands for there to be justice served for people who are actually wreaking havoc in their country and attempting to disrupt the peace.
I think this is a very excellent point about what these two sides, the Bolivarian Republic on one hand and the right-wing imperialistic side on the other hand, what they represent. I think even Edmundo Gonzalez was part of the part of the Venezuelan mission in El Salvador's death squad. So it's a very scary situation if they come to power. I mean, the international left has no say to on who won the election. I mean, it is about the Supreme Court and Venezuelan people, but I think we do need to say out open that we are very, very scared about the opposition if they come to power. Joe, if you could just briefly talk about the different economic visions represented by the right wing of in Venezuela on one hand, and the Chavez-led Bolivarian project on the other hand, because class support was a huge thing on which Chavez rode to power.
Definitely. Well, of course, one of the main sort of proposals of the Bolivarian Revolution was generally to use the country's wealth to support programs for the people's social and economic well-being. And so the major push was the nationalization of the oil industry, the hydrocarbon reform that took place. This, of course, completely goes against how the Venezuelan oligarchy had managed their affairs historically. And not only the nationalization of the oil sector, but also the mineral wealth, the gold that Venezuela has, platinum, and many other, very valuable resources in the country being put under state control so that the people could benefit from these riches and not transnational companies and, sort of the few members of the elite that would manage and administer these companies and these relations. We know that a lot of the people who are involved in the right wing, not all of them, but a lot of them come from these traditional families that had held power in the country, economic power, whether they were in charge of the different major companies. We know that Maria Corina Machado has family members who owned one of the private metal companies, which of course was nationalized under Chavez. So this is a clear class interest. There was a lot of land that was expropriated from these different companies and oligarchic families that was turned over to the people so that they could have housing in the city, so that they could build their own homes. a family that was turned over to peasant communities so that they would be able to grow their own food, and actually try to build food sovereignty within the country. So there's clear class interests involved here. And it's not to say that the Venezuelan right wing does not have, working class people in it, but a lot of those who are leading the charge since 1998 and have really formed the backbone of this opposition, and the ones who have been leading a lot of these attempts to destabilize the Bolivarian Revolution and essentially take back what they consider to be theirs as opposed to the property of the people, that many of these are indeed rooted in these business owning families historically. So the class nature of the Bolivarian Revolution is always there. And, not to say it in a simplistic way, but really, even just on a surface level, going to a march of the right-wing opposition, of course, again, I won't say that there's no working people in that are supporting Maria Corina Machado. That would be a lie. But you see a lot more light-skinned people, a lot of people coming from the wealthy sectors of Caracas. Important to note that the majority of the rallies that are held by the opposition are not held in the popular sectors. They're actually held in the richest part of the city, the east of Caracas. This is not an accident. Of course, they hold it where their social base is the biggest. And when you go to a Chavista rally, there is a difference. You see a lot more diverse faces, you see working people, you see a lot of women, Afro-Venezuelans across the board. So as much as the right wing attempts to make this narrative into something that's just about their fight for freedom and an end to autocracy, I think what's clear in that anyone who's studied the Bolivarian Revolution and has followed it is that, of course, this is once again a situation of class struggle and of a revolutionary process trying to build a socialist future. Again, as we said earlier, it's not a process that's perfect. There's a lot of zigs and zags. There's, of course, counter-revolution that's supported by imperialist forces. But again, it is a process of the dispossessed in Venezuela taking back what's theirs, which is the mineral wealth, which is these massive companies, which is trying to use the land that they have to grow their own food. Venezuela used to import over 70% of food that they consumed. This is ridiculous given the fact that it's a country with such rich agricultural land. That's been a huge struggle and a big emphasis of the revolution, is actually reasserting its food sovereignty, recovering the ancestral foods that they used to eat, and not, for example, pasta that's imported from the United States and from Europe. So the cultural process around this revolution of recovering Venezuela's national identity as opposed to succumbing to the imperialist influence, as opposed to succumbing to the interests of the United States and European countries, is at the center of the Bolivarian process, and this economic struggle for control over the country's resources is really, really at the crux of how we understand what happens in Venezuela.
It also seems that this strangulation, economic strangulation through the sanctions, has actually worked very effectively in breaking away some of the class support in the last 7 to 8 years, and that's where part of the right wing is trying to ride on. I want to ask you a little bit about the Latin American response to Venezuela in general, and what has happened recently. We have seen some very clear statements. For instance, in case of AMLO in Mexico, and also some cautious statement from Colombia and Brazil. But also on the other hand, we have seen pretty much accepting the imperial line, definitely in Argentina, but also, if I'm not mistaken, Boric in Chile and others. Venezuela seems to be very key in terms of at least the radical Latin American project that fight against imperialism, that fight against Western corporations. Can you tell us a little bit about what the response of these countries have been? And if you could also spell out a little bit about what different organizations within these, how different organizations within these countries have also responded to.
Yeah, well, it has been a very interesting response from the region, and looking historically, or at least at the past several years, there has been a noted shift within the region, of course, because of the political composition of the region, who's in power, what progressive victories have taken place across the continent. Um, but of course, we saw the ALBA countries, Honduras, Cuba, many Caribbean countries, you know, immediately respect and congratulate the re-election of Nicolas Maduro. These are countries that have been working together for many years. They're very familiar with the Venezuelan system. Many of them have been electoral witnesses. But then, so this is one block, and I think until now, there's been dozens of countries, not only from Latin America and the Caribbean, but across the world, that have recognize the validity of these results. Um, we've seen, of course, no surprise that the Javier Mileis of the continent have, not only after the elections, but really, again, all of these people who have had this complete rejection of the results and insisting on the fraud narrative, it's not unexpected because this is exactly what they had said ahead of the election. So it's sort of this pre-crafted narrative to say anything that happens in Venezuela is fraudulent, is manipulated. Um, and they have maintained this hard line. And we know that just ahead of the elections, there was a group of right-wing, former presidents, some members of parliament from different countries, but all sort of with this hard right agenda that attempted to travel to Venezuela to allegedly serve as electoral observers. However, they had not been invited by the CNE. They didn't have proper documentation, so they were unsurprisingly unable to enter the country. This created a huge storm, which was, seemingly a pre-concocted sort of media charade. Marta Lucia Ramirez, who was the vice president of Colombia, with Ivan Duque, who was one of the major allies of the U.S. government during its years of attacks against Venezuela when he was in office. Vicente Fox, another, hard right figure that was a major ally of the United States. They attempted to go, and then their denial of entry became another point to say that, oh, there's fraud happening, there's irregularities, there's all these problems. So it was sort of expected that these sort of groups, these right-wing think tanks like Ideagrupo, would have this sort of response, because that's essentially what they had been concocting and manufacturing leading up to the elections. And of course, the United States had the reaction that was, mostly expected, and a repeat of 2019 by just saying, well, we've now decided to recognize that Edmundo Gonzalez won the elections. And in the middle of this, in between this sort of expected fraud narrative from the right wing, there has been a group of countries that has decided to chart a different path and to call for peace and to call for sort of a calming down of these tensions. And this is Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And they have essentially said that the response from these right-wing governments to attack Venezuela, to undermine the legitimacy of the electoral process, is not conducive to a peaceful solution. It's not conducive to, healthy diplomatic tension, diplomatic relations in the region. And it's called for essentially calm until more detailed results are released. And this has been a very important stance in terms of actually kind of really pulling back the United States even. We know that these leaders had a call with members of the Biden administration we saw them sort of take a step back from their initial approach after this call. Boric also, who had initially had a very, very sort of right-wing posture on what had happened in Venezuela, saying that these results were fraudulent, et cetera, et cetera. He also sort of modified his position to be a little less confrontational after speaking to Lula. Um, and they have essentially said that we want to support the Venezuelan people in their quest for peace and for sovereignty, and that, these very incendiary statements do not serve the goal of creating peace in the region, do not serve the goal of helping the Venezuelan people recover from, again, these decade of intense attacks. And so they have sort of held this middle of the road position. And yeah, of course, the statements by Gabriel Boric are reprehensible, very unfortunate at this moment. What Venezuela needs as it again emerges from an economic war, which is currently being subjugated to, is peace. And we saw in the days after the election that there was very, very intense outbreaks of violence being waged by far-right opposition. And still you had these countries egging it on, saying that these protests were righteous. And this is, of course, in no way supporting the well-being of the Venezuelan people. So the response in the region, I would say, it has been different from other times, especially if we're looking at 2017 during the Guarimbas. There was an attempt to really unite the region against Venezuela under the Lima group. And they essentially created this group with the sole purpose of attacking Venezuela. And this had support of Colombia, it had support of Brazil and Mexico. Enrique Peña Nieto was in office. So these major countries, which today are taking this more cautious, patient approach, had been fully backing these attempts to attack Venezuela before. And so I think it's really important to note the shift there, and that, of course, the progressive wave leaves many things to be desired, but this shift in the region has really actually opened up space for Venezuela to actually have allies, friends, and partners who are not going to attack it at the drop of a dime.
You mentioned a lot of countries. We will have you again to discuss and unpack some of these twists and turns within those countries. But for today, we'll leave it there. So thank you so much for your time. It was such a privilege to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me, and great show.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.